So yesterday I had a few thoughts about the topic. I didn't really have that much to say. I suggested a couple of books that you ought to go take a look at, and I grumbled about the topic. So today I'm back with a few more thoughts. I have a couple of interpretive wrinkles that I think go along with the verb in the topic, and then I have a couple of ideas for affirmative directions, and then one idea for a negative direction that would only be for very, very specific encounters. And in particular, what I mean by encounters is real specific judges, because most judges, I think, would kind of choke on this negative approach. But it could be useful in some pivotal debates. But let me first of all start with some of the things that go along with the word is. It's interesting. I'm going to save talking about privacy for another day, chiefly because privacy is the kind of thing you're going to have to research. I talked in the video yesterday about all the different domains, all the different categories of privacy, and the difficulty a lot of people have had in even putting a definition on it. And then with the word undervalued, well, I mean, that's where the debate is going to happen. If you can agree on what you mean by privacy, and if you can work out the baggage that comes along with the word is, then undervalued is just where you have your value, your criteria, your contentions, and you're off to the races. But there are a couple of things that go along with the word is. One of the questions I think you have to settle right away is, does the word is it in present tense or in present indefinite tense? Present tense. It is sunny outside my window right now. And really about 15 minutes ago it was raining, so that's present tense as in that is a recent development. That's right now as distinct from any other time. So privacy is undervalued. Today, in 2012 or spring of 2013, privacy is undervalued. But the other sense of it is present tense indefinite, which would be something like water is wet. Well, water has been wet since the beginning of the world and will be wet, presumably, as long as the laws of nature are the way they are right now. So water is wet is not referring to just right now. It is a necessary and enduring condition. Now, I think that you would have an easy time, if you're affirmative, saying that really the word is in the topic is present tense, simple present tense, not present tense indefinite, because if it's present tense indefinite, then you have an impossible burden. You have to prove that there is that there's something about privacy that makes people undervalue it. If I were negative, I think I would hold on to that argument just because I've done this a few times in practice debates with my own debaters just to keep them on their toes. If you're up against an affirmative who's a little bit sloppy and doesn't define the words in the topic, and you have a judge who can be patient with a little game playing, then I think what you could do is you could say the affirmative has a lot of leeway in defining the terms in the topic, but if the affirmative chooses to start the debate not having defined them, then they forfeit that opportunity to me. And I'm going to define the term is as meaning present tense indefinite. It is therefore my opponent's burden to prove that there is something about human nature that makes us undervalue privacy. And if pressed, you could give examples. You could say, well, you know, there is something in human nature that seems to love gossip, and loving gossip might be undervaluing privacy. So there are ways the argument could be made, but really it's about, has the affirmative fulfilled their burdens? And in this case, not defining the word is wouldn't necessarily be a voting issue, but it does give me the right to define the word is, and constructives are now over, and that's the only definition in the debate. This is not something that I would do with an unfamiliar judge, and it's not something that I would stake the round on in an important debate. And you even want to think, is that necessarily high-quality debating? But there are moments where it's a good teachable moment. If you know your opponent, you're good friends with your opponent is working their way up, still fairly new, and could use some sort of near miss to teach them to be careful. Then in a situation like that, you might be able to make that kind of argument. A second implication that goes on with the word is, I think, and this is kind of the intersection between is and undervalued, is it the case to say that something is undervalued if there's a significant movement in the other direction? If there is a vocal segment of the population that does value it and is trying to spread the word about it? Is the gospel undervalued? Well, the gospel is undervalued by some people, and the gospel is held priceless by another group of people. How do you weigh out and make a decision whether the gospel is undervalued? I mean, you could say, if you want to reason by analogy, in a lot of the interpretive issues, I found that analogies work really well to make it clear for a judge. Is the house on fire if the fire department's there and they're hosing it down? That, I think, would be the affirmatives analogy, because yes, the house is still on fire, even if they've got almost all the fire out. If you can see flames coming out of the house, then the house is on fire. So if you can see that a substantial portion of the population undervalues privacy, then privacy is undervalued, and that's a reasonable interpretation. But I think you could say, I think maybe the negative analogy could be something like, well, what if it was resolved good manners are ignored, polite behavior is ignored? Well, polite behavior is not ignored by the entire population, and there are a lot of people for whom polite behavior is really, really very important. And polite behavior is most noticeable when it's absent. So the fact that impolite behavior is conspicuous, it goes too far to say that polite behavior is ignored. So you want to give some thought to what does it mean that there are people who have differing opinions. I mean, that's one of the defects with the topic, but because you're stuck with it, you're going to want to be as inventive as you can in trying to figure out a way to explain to the judge, depending on which side of the topic you're on, whether the existence of this division means that presumption is toward your side or presumption is toward your opponent's side. Does the affirmative have the bigger burden, or does the affirmative get to say if there's a noticeable subset who undervalue privacy, that's enough? Or does the negative get to say if a lot of people are speaking up in favor of this value, then it's not undervalued? It's just something that's in the process of being worked out, just like every value premise from the beginning to the end of human history. There are always people who don't appreciate it, but where there are vocal people who are spreading the word about it, then that's all any value has ever had. And we would have to say that every value was undervalued if that condition meant that things were undervalued. Now, the last thing I can say is it's similar to the second point that I made about the word is. It's a little bit different. How big does the affirmative's case have to be? How large does the scale have to be in order for the affirmative to have met their burden under is undervalued? And the analogy that I have here is, this is a little crackpot, but I deal in crackpot analogies. The example that I would give is I would say, if someone wanted to say resolve, dirt is tasty. You would think that would be a pretty hard resolution to prove, right? But there is actually a documented medical condition called, I never know whether to pronounce it pica or pica, but it's a condition in which people go out and eat dirt and actually crave dirt. Now, it's a very, very small segment of the population, but for them, dirt is tasty. If you were, on the other hand, to say resolved, chocolate is tasty, well, a whole lot, a large segment of the population thinks it's at least reasonably good tasting. So I think you could say it's a reasonable interpretation on the part of the affirmative if I can prove that there are social structures, there are social institutions in place that are very widespread, that are culture-wide, that impact everybody every day, and reasoning from those, I am saying that privacy is undervalued. Then that's reasonable. And the affirmative could say it's too much to expect me to establish a water is wet relationship and prove that it's universal. That's just unwinnable. No affirmative will ever win under that burden. But if you subject me to the chocolate is tasty test, to where it really is so large that everybody in the room can recognize that it has an effect on all of us, then probably that means that my burden has been met. So then what I think is going to happen is I think a lot of affirmative cases this year are going to come in basically two contentions. Contention number one is going to be to describe those social institutions, to document that they exist. And then contention number two is going to be to make the argument that those institutions, that those patterns in social behavior, they prove that privacy is undervalued. And just like I had 3 books yesterday for the negative to go out and get, I've got 1 book that I think affirmatives ought to take a look at because I think you could write a spiffy little case. But let me make a couple of prefatory comments before I get to that book and that affirmative direction. One of the things I think is tricky when you're picking your case, and I think that there's a lot of agreement out there in Stoa land because I've heard a lot of people express this opinion, is you want to make sure it's not the set of arguments that your judges are going to choke on given their political beliefs. And the judging pool is not politically homogenous. Not all judges have the same political leanings. But there are some directions that are very risky, and there are some that are very safe. And given the subject matter of privacy, there are some things you want to steer clear of. Some of the ways you could go with privacy, you could talk about police doing unreasonable searches and seizures and how a lot a lot of indictments really ought to be thrown out, and a lot of evidence in criminal trials really ought to be suppressed. But the problem is when you get clash going on both sides, if you have reasonably politically conservative, or not even conservative, but just people who believe in law and order, that's the kind of thing where a close debate is going to go towards people who think that you ought to make the police's job easier. So even though that's a direction you could go, and on the affirmative saying that privacy is undervalued, you would say that more searches should be thrown out and the police should operate under more restrictions to where they are not violating the privacy of the accused. That's something that's not very strategic. You can predict that a lot of judges are going to come down to weighing the two sides, and down in their gut, they're going to want your opponent to win, and that's not strategic. You could do the same thing to talk about the line of Supreme Court decisions having to do with abortion. If you do privacy is undervalued, you want to remember that Roe versus Wade was decided on the legal reasoning that women have a privacy right to decide with their doctor whether or not to proceed with an abortion. And you could write an affirmative based on that. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think you'd win a lot. So one of the things that you need to do is you need to give a little bit of thought to what directions can you go that are going to be appealing. And so I think what you ought to do is you ought to go out and get a book called Elsewhere USA. And it is by a sociology professor at New York University by the name of Dalton Conley. And I first taught this book a year or two ago in a class I teach called Technology, Change, and Communication. He coins a term in the book, and it actually won an award for being one of the worst new coined terms ever. Weisure, the convergence of work and leisure. And he makes a very involved, very complicated, but ultimately fascinating argument. He says that the distinction between work life and home life is being completely erased by technological advances. And just a couple of examples of this that I can throw out. There was a time where at the end of the workday, you went home and you left work at work, and when you were at home, you were at home. And the telephone was a piece of furniture that attached to the wall. You might have to talk to your parents to ask them what life was like back then. Not only were there no such thing as smartphones, there was no such thing as a cell phone. So once you had left the office, you weren't going to get a lot of incoming messages that you had to deal with. Today, on the other hand, if you wake up in the middle of the night, if you're an adult and you have a job, you can reach over to your nightstand, grab your smartphone, and do some work. Answer some emails. Work on some documents. It's also the case that today, at the office, you may have heard about this, the Friday after Thanksgiving is Black Friday, and you got all the doorbuster sales, and I assume you've seen that before, and the Monday that follows is Cyber Monday. And a lot of businesses with online dimensions to what they do, they make huge, huge portions of all the profits they're going to make that year on that Monday. And a lot of people are shopping from work. Well, in generations past, using work time for personal matters would have been a very, very serious infraction. Could get you reprimanded, could get you written up, could conceivably get you fired. You did not get on the phone in the middle of the day to make dental appointments for your kids because that was personal business. You did that on your own time. And there are probably some workplaces where that is still strictly enforced. But Conley evidences the argument pretty compellingly that that's gone away as well because work life and home life have become interchangeable. So I think you could write an affirmative with a first contention that talked about the convergence of work and home. And I hope that you can see how this is an erasure of privacy, because it's the home that is the private realm, and it's work that is the public realm of your life when you go out and you do business with other people who are not part of your family. And then I think in the second contention, you could make arguments about how this is detrimental. And Conley does some of this work in his book, and you could do some research other places to talk about how people have less time to devote their full attention to their family. People are going out to their kids' Little League games and then on the spot having to have an impromptu teleconference meeting on the phone because their boss feels like they can contact them evenings, weekends, during vacations, because there's no longer the distinction between the workplace and the private life. So that's a direction you might want to go. A second direction, this is a little bit of a shortcut. In specific circumstances, it could be a pretty powerful affirmative, but I think that a negative who's really thought through how to interpret private or privacy properly is going to be very ready for this. So it's something to think about, and when you're prepping for the negative, you do want to be ready for this. But there's one way you can define private Private is very simply the opposite of public. And if you talk about the public sector and the private sector, the public sector is all the institutions in the economy that are controlled directly by the government. And the private sector is that set of institutions where there is no direct public control. So businesses, nonprofits, anything that doesn't have a government affiliation is private. So if you, on the affirmative, wanted to say privacy is undervalued, you'd be playing a little fast and loose with the meaning, and you would really be saying privatization is undervalued, and that there are a lot of services the government provides that don't need to be provided by the government, and that the value to be offered by the private sector in doing a lot of government tasks, that's been undervalued. Now, I think that a negative who's really sat down and done her or his homework is going to be able to say privacy is not the same as privatization. I was surprised because I thought when I'd go looking that I would almost immediately find good definitions that kept these distinct. Instead, you'd be surprised how many people who say that's really kind of blurry. But there are some definitions out there that say that private is not only the opposite of public, but includes some idea of being hidden or secluded. So in that case, just being in the private sector would not be enough. And I think negatives could make a pretty compelling argument that including all of that debate in, as well as the debate over control over your information, control over your bodily integrity, control over your family and home decision making, that just makes the topic too big and too unmanageable. So it's something to think about. It's not necessarily something I recommend. Okay, last thing. Oh, wait a minute. There's one last affirmative approach, and this I think might go along the lines of the political grain of a lot of your judging pool, and that would be if you were to talk about how many smartphones are now GPS equipped, how many the spreading use of automated plate number recognition, which is the cameras that can recognize license plates on cars and thereby track where cars were. And I remember reading in about the past year a proposal where APNR cameras were going to be installed on all cars, which means that police departments in cities could have a constantly updated map where every car in the city was. I also remember in about the past year, there was a proposal here where I live in Oregon, in Portland, for there to be a tax system that was connected to how much you use the roads. So the heaviest users of the roads would pay the most toward maintenance. Well, the problem with that is you have to find some way of tracking when people are on the road. And all of that data collection about people's movements raises some serious questions for, is it a healthy thing for the government to know when people are moving at all times? And I think that you can make a pretty compelling argument, even though we think of our government as reasonably benevolent, even though we can see a difference between the government of the United States and the governments of totalitarian regimes. We are the way we are, and we have the freedom we have because we have things that we've never allowed the government to do. We have firewalls really in place that we've never given away our right to be anonymous in certain ways. We've never surrendered information on things like our basic movements from place to place. And if a strong leader ever came to power who wanted to sweep aside a lot of those safeguards, a lot of things like this, like APNR and GPS systems on smartphones and ways of collecting road usage taxes, those could be the way that a strong leader could crack down and really take away a lot of the freedom and break a lot of the safeguards that are in place. So you might do a little bit of research into that, using search terms like APNR, like GPS, associated with phrases like Big Brother. And you might be able to say, in the first contention, talking about a society-wide phenomenon, a social practice, you could say these things permeate our entire lives, and they're growing. And then you could say they're undervalued because of the threat to freedom. So that's an approach that you might want to tackle and see how much promise you find. Okay, the approach on the negative that is, I think, a little bit hazardous, but in particular debates, if you have a judge that you know very well who really likes really thought-provoking, possibly unconventional negative arguments, what I've heard this described as a res K, which is slang for resolutional critique. It's not a critique, trust me. Critique has a real particular meaning. It has to do with exposing efforts to hide power. Probably a more accurate way to describe it, there's a really old argument, the plan flaw, when you wrote, it's from Team Policy, but when you wrote your plan, you weren't thinking right, and so there's something important that you left out. I remember there was a team years ago that had their plan take effect on February 30th. And then there was another team that went almost the entire season with nobody really calling them on it, and they funded their very expensive plan with a tax on non-ferrous iron products. And if you look up ferrous, F-E-R-R-O-U-S, you'll see why that's funny. Those are both examples of plan flaws. If those are pointed out, that plan, implemented the way it was written, would be defective, and so the affirmative ought to lose. What I think you could say on the negative given this topic is, and actually in CETA debate at the college level, this is something they used to do for a number of years, and they called it a resolution flaw. The topic as written is incoherent. You cannot affirm the topic. The affirmative should lose the debate. The negative should win the debate because the topic as written is incoherent. And I think that you could explain these arguments and bring them to life using a few analogies. Now, one of my analogies you've already heard. It was the analogy that I came up with yesterday talking about undervalued. You can't answer the question of undervalued because of the Kim Kardashian on the one hand, she does undervalue it. Thomas Pynchon on the other hand, he probably overvalues it. And if you're talking the whole human race or even just the population of the United States, then there's nothing meaningful you can say because people's practices are so different. Let me digress here for about 2 seconds because I'll forget this point if I don't throw it in right now. I think that whether you're affirmative or you're negative, you'll be able to get away with saying that we need to draw kind of a line around the United States. I think you can say with minimal research that privacy expectations fluctuate from culture to culture, and that you could say we're members of the United States, we get to read publications published in the United States. The United States has a lot of co-cultures or subcultures, but really there is some level of cultural mutuality. There's some level of pooled culture across the United States, and if you think of a culture as a system of shared meanings, then that's a good way to make the logistics of this debate manageable, to give us something we can meaningfully talk about. If we try to talk about the whole human race, it's just going to get absurd because you have some people in burqas and some people who walk around naked all day, and they just have different expectations of privacy. All right, to get back to the point I was making before, I think you can make the point before Kim Kardashian, Thomas Pynchon, and large groups of people, there's nothing meaningful you can say. I think you could then bolster it with the point I made yesterday about all the different domains of privacy. And the analogy I think you use here is you say, what if the topic were resolve drinking liquids is healthy? Well, drinking water is a very good thing. We probably should all go have a glass of it right now and we'd be healthier. Drinking mercury, which is also a liquid, is not. So really, the statement, drinking liquids is healthy, it's not the kind of thing you can answer coherently. So at both ends of the topic, you have incoherent questions. You can't say whether it's undervalued. You can't even say whether a term that doesn't have one common referent, there aren't coherent statements of this nature that you can make about it. Now, the affirmative's answer, the affirmative I think would have a couple of answers to this. They would say, first of all, if you're right, then that means no affirmative can ever win. But you answer this, the way you answer this is really easy. You say, well, it's just your burden to go out and think up answers to this. You need to defend the topic. That's your burden to begin with. You know, if you win that privacy is overwhelmingly important, which you would think is part of being a good strategic affirmative, well, if that's a true statement, privacy is overwhelmingly important, then no negative could ever win. That doesn't mean I run up the white flag and surrender. That means I go out and I think up arguments to refute your claims about how important privacy is. So if I say this topic as written is incoherent, that doesn't mean I should lose because no affirmative could ever win, and that makes my argument defective. That puts the burden on you to think through why this topic as written is a meaningful statement. The other thing that I drew a blank for a second. The other thing I think you could do to make this argument pretty strategic is I think that you want to hold this in reserve until you debate an affirmative who has a really, really small case. Their applications are really small scale. And then you make these arguments about the topic being incoherent, and you say, now there are two ways you can resolve this issue. You could first of all agree with me the topic itself is nonsensical and cannot be affirmed, and you could vote negative on that basis. Or you could meet me halfway. You could say, because the topic has these major problems, and I think you'll have an easy time winning, but this topic does have some problems. Because the topic has these major problems, it's the affirmative's burden to take on a very expansive case, because it's more nonsensical than usual for them to attempt to affirm this topic with a small-scale case. So, if you're in a debate where the affirmative's already spoken, you've already heard the affirmative constructed, and they've got a couple of little tiny examples, and they're examples you're not ready to debate. Maybe you reach into the back of your file box, or you reach into the back of whatever it is that you're carrying, and you pull out this strategy, especially if you know who the judge is. You make these arguments about the topic being unaffirmable, and you say at the very least this raises the bar for the affirmative. Small illustrations, small applications will not cut it. And then you leave the judge with the radical claim, the topic itself is defective, but then also the fallback claim. Okay, I'm not going to vote for you on the topic being defective, but I will be reasonable and say at least the affirmative has to take on a pretty big burden for this topic to have any meaning at all. And then I think that gives you something to do, that gives you a little bit of a toehold in a debate where the affirmative's trying to wrongfoot you with something that's small and obscure. So, those are some approaches, and maybe that'll help you get started. And if you have questions, or if you have ideas that follow up on this, shoot them my way, dr.srader@gmail.com, and I will field them just as soon as I get the opportunity.